What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode 36 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, we have a rare episode with another guest here, and we're lucky to have Mr. Milo Wolf here to join us. If you guys were listening to the podcast a few episodes ago, we had an episode going over some of the range of motion for hypertrophy research. At the very end of that episode, after Josh and I rambled and hypothesized for a while, we decided we should probably get somebody on that is doing this for their kind of PhD investigation. So that is Mr. Milo's kind of area of expertise here. So we're going to go over some of the things we discussed in that podcast, but also discuss some of the studies, particularly one study that came out since that podcast came out, talk about how they may change things, and then just kind of go through some of the things we discussed and see if Milo thinks we're absolutely full of it on anything and see if we were missing the point at all. I'm excited to kind of get into this discussion and to kick us off here. As I said, Milo is doing his PhD at Solent University under Dr. James Steele, investigating range of motion for hypertrophy. That's kind of the standout title there, but Milo, I don't know if you want to give any more information about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zach did a really good job of introducing me. PhD student at Solent, doing my PhD on range of motion and muscle hypertrophy and strength. More broadly interested in all things muscle strength and muscle hypertrophy, mostly hypertrophy because it's what the girls like. And otherwise, I'm also an online coach. I've been coaching for around 4 years now and been lifting for 7 or 8 years, competing in both powerlifting and bodybuilding. So I have an interest in both personally as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You aced it.
Cool.
Didn't know you were looking at strength as well.
Yeah, that's what I was literally going to say the same thing. I didn't know if you were as interested in that, so I might have some follow-up questions on that.
So right now, as Zach called you, you're Mr. Milo Wolf, but at what point will you become Dr. Milo Wolf? Like, how far along are you? Like,
That's
where
a
are
good
you
point.
in that process?
That's a good point. So I think I should be done, and this is always the PhD struggle, is that you never quite know when you'll be done, especially before you first submit your PhD and get to know whether you have to submit major corrections or minor corrections or what have you. But I think I should be done within around a year, so I'm around 2 years
Oh,
in
wow.
now, which in the UK is 2 out of 3 years total.
Nice, man.
Beautiful.
So
So
are
I think
you
we
guys
just call them that now, I think, is what that means.
Yeah. So are you
Sorry,
guys
call me now.
have you guys done all the data collection, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so my PhD has 4 different studies, 3 of which involve sort of different than traditional data collection. Namely, I did one systematic review or meta-analysis, which just involved basically collecting all the data from previous studies on range of motion and muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength and sort of summating it together to get an idea of what the data says so far. And then 2 of the other studies are survey studies and interview studies. And then the final study is an intervention study where we get people to train with either a partial range of motion or a full range of motion and look at how strength and hypertrophy develop or don't. Who knows? Maybe none of this works. After the program, when they did partial versus full range of motion. So I'm done with data collection for the first 3, and then with the intervention study, the one where we're actually training people, that's starting in September.
Nice.
Awesome.
Cool, man.
Sweet. Cool. So let's kick it off into this kind of discussion around this new study that, like I mentioned, we kind of went through a brief synopsis of, I would say, most of the recent studies. Milo is definitely going to have a better handle. He mentioned he did that or is in the process of publishing, I believe, the meta-analysis on range of motion. And so he's probably definitely going to have a better handle on some of the older research that was included on some of the earlier meta-analysis on this topic. But we kind of talked about the most recent research. So the Pedrosa study, the Sato study, some of those that we, like I said, that we mentioned. But one that we didn't talk about was this new Mayo study that just came out and got some solid traction on social media. So this one followed a really, really similar design to one of the studies we did discuss by the same lab group that was kind of investigating the hamstrings. But this one instead was on the triceps. Very brief design. Milo, Josh, let me know if I'm missing anything. This was another within participant design. So they had one arm of each participant train like a general cable tricep extension in which their arm was directly at their side. The other limb did an overhead tricep extension where they're basically just extending their elbow, the same total range of motion, 0 to 90 degrees, but that would result in at least the long head of the triceps being at a longer muscle length. And what they saw in this study, we're going to go into a little bit of the stats nuances here in a second, but substantially greater growth in the group that was training at longer muscle lengths. And so it kind of seems to go in line with the overall body of evidence we were talking about there. But one interesting part about this, at least when you look at the reported statistics, was that some of the some of the sites of the triceps that aren't impacted in terms of their muscle length when you actually move the humerus to a overhead position, also seem to substantially grow more from the group training the overhead tricep extension, which is a little bit interesting to kind of go with the rest of the research and try to have an overlining hypothesis that tries to connect everything. So, Milo, I don't know if you have any kind of just thoughts out the gates here. Like I said, we're probably getting a little bit of the, I don't want to say misdone stats, because that's not what it is, and it wasn't malicious. It's probably just a slightly different way of calculating some of the things that would potentially influence the way that we look at these results. But just out of the gate there, guys, what do we kind of think about this study and how it fits overall in the rest of the research?
Do you want to go first, Josh, or do you want me to take it?
Go for it, man.
Nice. So honestly, one of my first thoughts seeing that, so obviously triceps, three muscles, only one of them actually crosses the shoulder joint and thus is impacted by shoulder positioning in terms of muscle length, and that's the long head of the tricep. Now, seeing that both the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head grew similarly, and they all grew more in the overhead extension condition versus the pushdown condition, that made me think, oh, maybe it's just like a small sample size thing where, because it's a small sample size, just by the people in one group having better genetics or better outside factors or a million other confounders, maybe that's what explains the greater hypertrophy in the overhead extension condition. But then when you look at the design, actually, and this is a really good thing in that more range of motion studies might want to do in the future, is they used a within subject design, which means they did a different program or different condition with different limbs. So that takes into account a lot of confounders, like, let's say one person, one group has a lot better diet than the other person. That group might have better results as a result of that, you know? Whereas if you have a within subject design, that takes all of that into consideration and hopefully helps to isolate that variable that we're trying to test a lot more. And so in this study, my first instinct was, oh, maybe it's a between subject design, and that's what explains the difference. Turns out it's not. And so, honestly, I have no idea why the lateral and medial head grew as much more like it did for the long head. Like, you could try and hypothesize, oh, maybe it's the length tension relationship where at very long muscle lengths, for example, active tension drops off, which might explain something. But then muscle length should still be the same. You could argue that, if muscle length is greater for a long head in the overhead extension condition, it thus can't contribute as much anymore to the movement as it would during a pushdown. And so it shifts more of the work towards the lateral and medial heads. But that just still doesn't really sit right with me. It's not a compelling enough rationale for me to be like, oh, that's definitely why. And so for now, I mean, as we'll discuss later in the podcast, this study just adds to the overall body picture where generally longer muscle lengths probably a good thing for hypertrophy. Whether I think that overhead extensions now grow the lateral and medial heads more than pushdowns, my instinct is to say at best they probably grow them the same because there's no other compelling reason to think they would grow them more. At worst, I could see them potentially, I don't know, growing it slightly less or something because the contribution might be lower. But honestly, I wouldn't do overhead extensions for the lateral and medial heads, for example. I don't think that's reasonable.
Yeah, so I'm just going to summarize what you kind of get on there, and then I have a follow-up question. And Josh, obviously, interrupt me if you have anything that's pertinent. So again, when we're kind of looking at this study, the biggest thing that was surprising in line with the rest of the evidence that we saw is, like Milo said, only one of the heads of the triceps crosses the shoulder joint. And so only one of those heads of the triceps, muscle length, is going to be impacted by the actual shoulder positioning. And so if we take that into account with all this other research, again, that we summarized on episode 34 of the podcast, I believe is the one that it was, we would expect, if it was in line with everything else, that the long head would indeed grow more. But the other two heads of the tricep, the medial head and the lateral head, they aren't really impacted in terms of their muscle length when you move that arm around into that overhead position. Thus, in general, we wouldn't really expect that to matter. But in this study, again, the results seem to show meaningfully greater hypertrophy in those heads as well. Now, one thing that was kind of some topic of discussion on Twitter about this study was the way that what's called an effect size was calculated. So generally, all this is kind of trying to get at is how meaningful was this difference in some sort of standardized units of measurement. And the way that they reported the effect size in the paper was a little bit different than what we generally would look at. And so these are some pretty large numbers that made it kind of all seem pretty similar in terms of the magnitude of growth. However, when you look at these kind of corrected in terms of the way that we would generally look at effect sizes, well, kind of skip the nuances there, but just kind of trust me on that, hopefully. I think it's actually a little bit more reasonable to me. Now, this presupposes that like the standard thresholds for effect size mean something. But when we look at the long head, it does kind of cross that threshold of a small effect. And then the other sites are more so trivial effects. That kind of seems to be similar to me in terms of what we would actually expect. So I think that's probably the route that I would go. And then the rest of the difference may be either just spurious measurement or one of the hypotheses that the authors put in the paper that Milo, I'm interested to get your take on. I think they were just kind of throwing darts at the wall to kind of try to explain things, but it's interesting nonetheless, especially with one of the other studies that we'll talk about. They kind of hypothesized some sort of like blood flow mediated something with the arm being in the overhead position, some sort of metabolic stress related thing there, and they thought that was another mechanism. But just based on kind of the effect size thing I mentioned there, which again, let's not go too far in the stats weeds here, but I think that kind of helps me understand this and fit this in with everything else a little bit better, which would suggest exactly what Milo said. Long head seems to be at least related to muscle length in some fashion, and the other two probably just kind of a spurious conclusion here. But the authors seem to have some other hypotheses why would have been the case. But I think this kind of neatly fits in line. And I think another thing that Milo did a great job pointing out was when we went over the research, that was a huge disadvantage of this research at large, is that a lot of the studies don't feature within participant designs. And the only other study that I think that we went over that did this was the other Mayo study that also had really kind of consistent findings with this long muscle length hypothesis. That one was really cool because they were able to kind of test the counterfactual in that one. But yeah, I think that was kind of my thought when I looked at this a little bit closer. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, go for it, Josh.
No, go for it.
Come on, man, you make me blush. Um, so you mentioned there was one other study doing unilateral training, or just one limb at a time to isolate that variable as much as possible. There's been another one, I think Pedrosa et al. So Pedrosa and colleagues did the leg extension study, where they looked at four different groups. One group did full range of motion, one group did only the first part of the range of motion, so when the quads are most lengthened. One group did only the last part when they're most shortened, and then one group did a combination of partials in the lengthened range and partials in the shortened range. And I think those were also single leg, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm gonna double check.
Cool, sounds good. Um, and I was going to mention briefly in regards to, I do agree that more studies should aim to be single limb or within subjects to maximize power, statistical power, to, either you need fewer participants to find good conclusions or reliable conclusions, or you can get the same number of people in and have more confidence in your findings. That said, obviously, when you're looking at strength, for example, let's face it, most people don't care about your single leg extension lunar max. Like, it's just not something people care about. And so for outcomes like those, you do trade off some level of external validity, or essentially, does this study actually mimic what you see in the real world, such that we can expect the results of the study to also be like the results you would see in the real world? Um, and for a study with single leg extension lunar maxes, that's potentially too far removed from, let's say, a competition squat lunar max to really be quite as helpful as a study using the squat would be, a full squat versus a partial squat. Um, but I do agree that for a lot of hypertrophy-based studies, I think within subject designs just do better because you're mostly interested in hypertrophy. The exercise selection is typically a bit more varied anyways, and people do perform single limb exercises in that context. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to sort of caveat that a little bit.
Yeah. So I believe the Pedrosa study was between participant design. So that one's such an interesting one because it doesn't do the best job of isolating one variable, but it kind of segues us nicely into that muscle length versus failure point discussion, because that one in particular, if we kind of isolate the conversation to the full range of motion versus the partial range of motion at the long muscle length, that seems to suggest that the failure point, at least to some degree in this case, seems to be somewhat indicative of hypertrophy. Now, I think I actually had a good conversation with Brian Bornstein on Instagram, kind of going through some of the nuances of defining failure point after our most recent podcast. And I think that is something that it's important to define. So when we say failure point, I think, and what I'm thinking when I reference that, it's more so a proxy of the region of the range of motion that is the most challenging, or there's the most tension, or however you want to say that. And Brian did a great job just kind of pointing out that failure point is a little bit more ambiguous, because there's a lot of things that can lead to a failure point that doesn't necessarily point to the region of the range of motion that is the most challenging. I was kind of taking that as a given in terms of, in most cases that would be pretty telling. But when you factor in things like the tempo in which you perform the movement, the how grindy the rep before the one you actually fail is, technically, the other one you could just fail at the bottom just because you're so gassed after that previous grindy rep. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the movement's the most challenging at the bottom, for example. Like, there's just a little bit more nuance that goes into it. So I think it's probably more accurate to kind of compare the muscle length versus the part of the range of motion that's the most challenging or has the most tension, is kind of would be the question I have for you, Milo, based on not only these more recent studies, but actually taking into account maybe some of these later studies. What are your kind of thoughts there in terms of, is one more important than the other? Are they both important? That kind of thing.
For sure. So I guess the whole sticking point versus failure point discussion is always a bit difficult to think about, because obviously the point at which you fail, or the point at which a lift is slow, for example, isn't necessarily the hardest point in lift. Like, you can reach your slowest velocity in a deadlift, let's say around the knees, but maybe that's not where your hardest point is, But let's sidestep that whole discussion because it's a bit
I agree.
complicated, let's say. I think, so I saw an infographic by you guys basically speaking about whether muscle length or the point at which you fail is more important for hypertrophy. Is that correct?
Oh boy, he's
Yeah,
coming swinging,
what
Josh.
one of us knuckleheads made that.
It was good. It was really good. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, so it was interesting to see it framed that way. I think it's important to remember that for a lot of exercises, you actually see a case where a full range of motion is actually a partial range of motion for the muscle group. So let's say a dumbbell fly for the chest. Sure, a full range of motion for that exercise would involve going from like your arms being quote unquote straight or like right in front of your body to being as far out as you could possibly get them. But even if you got that quote unquote full range of motion for that exercise, the first, I don't know, let's say 20-30%, there's very little tension on your chest, where you don't have the force requirements to complete that part of the range of motion are so low that it's essentially, you could consider it not really part of the exercise anymore. So with certain exercises, the muscle length discussion is a bit strange. For example, lateral raises, where yes, at the bottom, you probably have reasonably lengthened muscle lengths, or long muscle lengths, when you're at the bottom of the lateral raise, just standing there. But the tension is so low that it probably doesn't even matter. So it might be very difficult, assuming long muscle lengths are quite important for hypertrophy, it might be very difficult to make dumbbell lateral raises a good exercise for hypertrophy, period, unless you just do partials in that lengthened range with very heavy weights, compensate for the fact that the force requirements are typically very low compared to the force requirements in the more shortened positions. So straight up, if you want to make certain exercises more productive for hypertrophy, you might need to modify them quite a bit, like the dumbbell lateral raise. I think it's too early to say for sure whether absolute muscle length matters more than the failure point during exercise. My intuition is that you need both tension and muscle length to make it effective. If you only have muscle length, like a dumbbell lateral raise at the bottom, you probably don't get the most out of it because you just don't have enough tension to make it beneficial. if you have a lot of tension, but you don't get particularly long muscle lengths, based on the research we have now, there's been 4 studies so far, by the way. So this new tricep extension study, so the skull crusher, not skull crusher, push down versus overhead extension study is the 4th one comparing partial ranges of motion. So it's like 90 degrees, for example, in this case, which wasn't quite a full range of motion for elbow extension. It's the 4th study comparing a partial range of motion at different muscle lengths. Overall, 3 of those studies showed that, by and large, hypertrophy was better when the muscle was more lengthened. And then the final one essentially didn't show much, like in terms of either direction. So when you, obviously, I think you've spoken about this before, but when you add that to the existing isometric literature, where long muscle lengths are better, when you add that to the overall range of motion literature, where generally, if full range of motion involves longer muscle lengths, it's better than a partial range of motion. When you add all that together, the picture emerges that longer muscle lengths are important, but I just don't see that being the case independently of tension. So I think if the failure point is at a very clearly shortened point, that's likely not ideal by any means. But if you still get a very good deal of tension at pretty long muscle lengths, it's probably still a decent exercise, is my hunch. Because I think we have a decent amount of studies now overall that compare partial range of motion to full range of motion. And some of these exercises probably will have a failure point near a shortened length. And you just don't see that big of a difference between partial and full range of motion overall for hypertrophy. So my hunch is that as long as you have a decent amount of tension at a decently long muscle length, that's the main thing. Now, if you wanted to optimize hypertrophy, do I think the failure point would ideally be at pretty long muscle lengths, and maybe you would even avoid short muscle lengths entirely? Potentially. It's something I'm open to with the amount of sort of corroborating evidence we have now. It's something I'm more and more inclined to consider. And I think if you want to experiment with partials, definitely do them at long muscle lengths. And if you want to maximize hypertrophy, go for it. For strength, I still think specificity is very important. Obviously, hypertrophy is super important for strength because you need to maximize your muscular potential to get to your maximal strength eventually. But beyond that, specificity is super important. Practice how you play. So those are essentially my thoughts in a very long-winded fashion.
Yeah, so I'll try to summarize kind of what you said again, and let me know if I'm missing anything. It probably is the best to say, at least combining kind of what we said in this past podcast in combination with what you just said, if all is held equal, longer muscle lengths are probably better. But the reality is that doesn't always happen in practice. So there probably is a level of sufficiency in terms of where that failure point at the point of most tension occurs that needs to be long enough for that actual increase in muscle length to actually matter. So when we're picking movements, yes, kind of probably going towards longer muscle length is going to be a good thing. But if you sacrifice that to the extent that there's absolutely zero tension in that range of motion, it probably doesn't make any sense, which is a perfect way to think about it, in my opinion, because it just prevents you from getting to some really weird conclusions. I think that was one of the last questions I have, but I'm going to actually ask you now. The question I always have with these kind of things, you already mentioned like small sample research. This is, generally the way that I like to view these kind of things is idea fuel for training and for coaches to kind of experiment with and then find what works with their individual clients. Because we all know, even if these on average long muscle lengths are better, on an individual basis, there's nothing to say that in some certain circumstances, short muscle lengths could be beneficial for a certain outcome. So that's usually how I view these things. But the question I like to ask myself when a new body of research like this kind of starts gaining traction and seems to have some pretty attractive results, what is the thing that would be the biggest mistake that people listening to this podcast and interpreting this evidence would make if they take this muscle length stuff to the absolute fullest extent and just completely run with it? What is the biggest mistake in their training they would be making? Otherwise, if they would have taken a more moderate approach on this, maybe tried some things out, maybe moved in that direction a little bit, but didn't just take it and absolutely run with it. What is the thing you would probably that comes to mind there in terms of the mistakes they would make?
Man, that's a good question. Honestly, with how much evidence there is now with the isometric literature, let's go way back, the animal studies back in the day, the infamous hyperplasia studies where by stretching out.
Gotta stretch the wings, brother.
Exactly, stretch those wings out. Basically, they I think weighted down some wings on some birds and had them stretched out for a long time under load, and they saw that hey, this thing happened that we don't really think happens in humans, which is instead of fibers just growing in size, muscle fibers, so that's how your muscle gets bigger. New fibers existed, like they increased the number of muscle fibers they had. Um, so, anyways, tangent with that literature, the isometric literature, the range of motion, full range of motion, partial range of motion, the partial range of motion at different muscle lengths, there's a lot of data now. And so part of me is like, honestly, I don't think you can go that wrong at this point with experimentation. Like, at the very worst, let's say you went to the complete extreme and you said, hey, let's only do isometric contractions at long muscle lengths. So pull ups, no, that hangs now only. And even then, you could probably set it up somehow to get like a deeper stretch still than you would like maybe the bottom of a barbell pullover for your lats, and just to hold that for as long as you can, for not as long as you can, like maybe 30 to 60 seconds to roughly mimic the time of retention that you would get from a set of 5 to 25 reps or whatever. Even if you went that far, based on literature overall, I'm not sure you would get meaningfully worse results for most people. Do I think it's possible to get worse results? Absolutely. Like, we just don't have enough data to be like, the confidence interval for hypertrophy is not small enough to eliminate the possibility that you get worse results. But do I think the difference is going to be huge? Possibly. Not really. And I think on that balance, with more moderate approaches, you will probably see a slight improvement. Whether or not it's going to be meaningful to a lot of people, that's a different discussion. How do you even measure hypertrophy? Just pictures or looking at yourself in the mirror? How do you tell what's big enough difference for you to care about? It's complicated. But I think because injury is a lot more complicated than I'm willing to delve into now, and like, do I think, for example, switching to only isometric low muscle length is going to be more injurious? Honestly, I don't know. I'm not willing to say yes or no. So I'm going to assume there's not really a difference. That's sort of my default position in terms of injury. Um, so I don't see how you can go too wrong, honestly. I think experiment with it. And I think a more practical consideration could be if implementing all these new ideas, this new science, causes you to stray so far from your previous training that gauging progression becomes difficult. That might be a bit of a mistake potentially. If you're the sort of person who is motivated by numbers, like quantifiable progress, like as in I did this much a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, a few years ago, and now I can do this much. That might be a mistake in terms of gauging progression, in terms of implementing or prescribing progression. Or if you're someone who struggles to push yourself hard enough to, let's say, you struggle to push yourself past RP5, and thus you may be leaving some gains on the table, arguably. Um, in that case, you might need some previous data to inform your current load decisions, like what weight you use and how many reps you perform that for. But outside of those scenarios, as I've been saying, like, I don't really see how you can go too wrong, to be honest, given that the effect sizes would be small either way, you know?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with that on the whole. The one example that comes to mind for me that I've been trying to think about, but I don't think I have a firm conclusion on this yet, is this kind of has a couple assumptions in it. So if you disagree with the assumptions, obviously the question becomes a little bit challenging, but let me know. Um, the question to me is, okay, on a per set basis, exercises that train at a longer muscle length and presumably have at least a decent degree of tension in that range of motion um, are probably a little bit more fatiguing on a per set basis as well. So then we get into a scenario that, okay, on a per set basis, we're more stimulative. But if we're just absolutely torching ourselves with partner overhead tricep extensions with a towel and leg extensions where our friend is holding our feet behind our backs and trying to absolutely maximize the muscle length and the tension thereof, does that ultimately result us in actually being able to do less training? That becomes a net negative. That is one thing I've thought about. And then the other factor is, you know, I definitely don't know this research to like a super well degree, but there's a few studies to my knowledge. One that comes to mind is the Fonseca study that, the regional hypertrophy benefits may, be a factor here as well. Training a muscle at a shorter length may be a little bit more for more proximal sites of a muscle, and maybe a little more stimulative as far as that goes. So, like you said, I think on by and large, if you don't take it to an absolutely absurd degree, I think it's probably a net positive, at least from what we have right now. But if you do take it to an absurd degree, which is kind of what I was thinking of with this question, because I'm sure there will be some people that will just start rigging up weird cable exercises to try to really take this principle to its fullest extent. That is one thing that comes to mind that I do potentially see as something that could somewhat meaningfully impact results if you're doing this over multiple years. If you're cutting your training down by, I don't know what the number is, just to throw a number out there, 40-50%, maybe that actually does end up being pretty meaningful over the years. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm happy to accept your premise or assumption that longer muscle lengths might be a bit more fatiguing inherently. As you and I have discussed before, actually, that might be partly explained by novelty. So whenever someone does something for the first time, this thing called the repeated bout effect, which is essentially as you repeat a certain stimulus or a certain, let's say a training session, for example, the response to it lessens over time, and that includes stuff like muscle damage and soreness. And so, let's say the first time you train legs, right, you get super sore. Second time, a bit less so, and that broadly, that obviously, how should I put it? It spans different training sessions too. So let's say you did leg press, it's probably still going to protect you to some extent from getting sore or a lot of muscle damage from squatting because they're reasonably similar. With longer muscle lengths, maybe you've never quite ventured that far in terms of you haven't gotten that much of a stretch before, and so it might be reasonably novel as a stimulus, and thus you don't have that protective effect yet, and you might get more sore and more muscle damage, which might, on the whole, prevent you from doing as many sets a week, or as close to failure, or anything else that might be deemed good for muscle growth. And thus, overall, you're getting less stimulus for muscle growth, and you're still hitting your recovery limits, which overall would mean you get less muscle growth. Now, let's assume as well that lower muscle lengths are better for hypertrophy on a per set, per RP, basically everything equated, lower muscle lengths, better for hypertrophy. But let's also assume that they're a bit more fatiguing. The question really lies in, do we think this gain stimulus is greater than the gain in fatigue? I'm inclined to say so, but honestly, we don't have any direct evidence to say what fatigue is like in response to more shortened versus more lengthened protocols, what have you, or at least not to my knowledge. And so it could be the case that we're wrong. But again, with fatigue, because we don't have that much evidence directly investigating that, I'm also inclined to say, probably not a huge difference. Anecdotally, we can say it might be more fatiguing, but if we have evidence that's stronger, or at least in my view, than anecdotes suggesting that there's better stimulus, then I'm willing to take that bet most of the time. So that's my first point, I guess, to borrow some jargon. The stimulus to fatigue ratio, I think, is probably still better with lower muscle lengths, which if you're able to train in terms of time availability to your fatigue limits, or your recovery limits, I should say, then that's something you should really consider. Otherwise, if you don't have enough time to train optimally anyways, then if longer muscle lengths are more stimulating and you don't have enough time in the week to train to your recovery limits anyways, then you probably should use longer muscle lengths because it's a better stimulus to time ratio, to use more jargon that no one really understands or knows about really. To address your second question regarding regional muscle hypertrophy, I think it's possible. From my reading of literature, generally, this is how it goes. A full range of motion promotes reasonably even hypertrophy across a muscle. A partial range of motion at short muscle lengths generally performs about as well as a full range of motion when it comes to more proximal sites. So that's, for example, proximal just means closer to the center of your body, which for our purposes can mean like roughly the navel or something, like the midsection. So for example, for your quads, proximal sites might mean closer to the hip versus closer to the knee. So in general, partial range of motion at short muscle lengths does about as well as full range of motion for those proximal sites, like near the hip for the quads. Now, when it comes to more distal sites, like closer to the knee maybe, it seemingly does worse than both full range of motion and partial range of motion at longer muscle lengths. From my understanding, further, a partial range of motion at long muscle lengths seems to do about as well for regional muscle hypertrophy across a muscle. And also, I could be wrong. Like there's just not enough data looking at regional hypertrophy following long muscle length partial range of motion exercise. That's a long sentence. Um, to say for sure, but from my reading of what's out there so far, I do think that partials and long muscle lengths seem to do about as good of a job at promoting even regional muscle hypertrophy as a full range of motion. So I don't see that as too big of a caveat, but I think if you're really concerned about promoting even muscle hypertrophy across the whole muscle belly, that might be a consideration. But then again, I think a lot of those considerations get washed out anyways when you have a broad enough exercise selection. So, like if you're doing just let's say a pull down long muscle length isometric, like at the top, then maybe yeah, you only get hypertrophy in certain areas or mostly in those areas, and maybe we miss out on a bit of lat hypertrophy on the iliac lat, the infamous. Um, but if you're doing, let's say, some row long muscle length isometrics as well, or some high row long muscle length isometrics, maybe that covers you pretty well. You know, that's what I think.
Josh, halftime. What do you got?
I don't want to take this too far off the rails. I do have a question I've been begging to ask. So I'll ask the question at the risk of taking us off the rails. So while you've been talking, Milo, a question that just kind of came to mind for me, and I'm curious if you've thought of this, during your whole PhD process and whatnot. It's like, is there any reason actually performing range of motion matters for hypertrophy? Does that make sense? So in other words, like you can do we see the proof of concept in the research that producing tension through an isometric, right, which is by definition zero range of motion, can lead to meaningful hypertrophy. I'm not aware of any research that compares isometric training to traditional resistance training. I'm not sure if you're aware of any or if any does exist. But just like from a mechanistic standpoint, everything I know or I've been exposed to about how muscle grows, I'm not sure if that's a massive part of the equation. I'm not sure if you have any insight on that.
Can I curse?
Go
You're
for
busting my balls here.
it.
So
Is that a curse word?
busting balls, maybe. I don't know. I'm being pretty PG-13 here. But
Man, yeah, I
anyways,
was gonna say we're gonna have to upgrade you from PG to PG-13, man. We're gonna have to
yo,
slap that on
there
the
you go. I said
episode of the
fuck now,
podcast.
so it's too late. Um, that's a really good question. Funnily enough, I'm not going to name drop, but someone in the industry who uses evidence-based methods has tasked us, giving us a research grant for it, essentially. Very informal, but a research grant nevertheless, to do a systematic or narrative review of the literature comparing concentric only, eccentric only, isometric only training and hypertrophy. Now, full transparency, Pac and I, we're the two people honest for now, have only gotten so far in about 4 months as doing the systematic searching and only starting that. So don't expect it out anytime soon. And honestly, this is why I'm going to tell you now. I don't really know if there's anything to that, like if isometric contractions are inherently worse for hypertrophy, because it's sort of at the back of everyone's mind if you have any sort of exercise science, sports science, or even just general lifting background. If you saw someone in the gym do an isometric contraction, you'd be like, are you warming up? Are you injured? What are you doing? You know, like this isn't how you train. This isn't how you grow muscles. Um, but honestly, I think a lot of the mechanisms that you think about for hypertrophy, for example, and obviously I'm not talking about strength here, because one thing I want to be clear about is I know you're data-driven strength and not data-driven physique. Um,
Is that an
but
attack?
hey,
That was a low blow, man. Busting my balls.
come on, man. Hey, I can start that spin-off for you if you want. I can be data-driven physique for you. Um, Anyways, for strength, I do think there is something to specificity, and the analyses in my meta-analysis sort of generally confirm this, that you probably want to train in a range of motion that you compete in, or you want to be strong in. But when you think about the mechanisms or the suggested mechanisms for hypertrophy so far, none of them really say, hey, you can't do isometrics, or isometrics wouldn't be ideal, you know? Like, to my knowledge, isometric contractions don't result in less metabolite accumulation, if that matters for hypertrophy. Muscle damage, let's not talk about it, it's probably not a thing anymore for hypertrophy. but tension as well. Like you get plenty of tension, if anything, at long muscle lengths with a lot of passive tension, and also um, it being a obviously tension is as simple as the heaviest weight possible, because otherwise you would just do a partial squat or even an isometric squat now all the time to maximize tension. It's obviously over time and all that stuff, and it's felt at the muscle level, not on the bar. Um, but all the mechanisms like tension, metabolite accumulation, motor unit recruitment, I don't see why they wouldn't be just fine with isometric contractions. And so, on a surface level, without having a look at the direct evidence comparing isometrics to concentrics only, to eccentrics only, or what have you, I don't really see why it would necessarily be worse. Um, there is I used to talk about this back in the day. There is a bit of an early adoption cost in the terms of like, first of all, from like a lifter psychology perspective, if that even matters at all. Uh, Sometimes people like having bigger fish to compare themselves to, and if you're the only fish
Oh,
doing isometric contractions,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was literally just gonna bring up as soon as you're done. It's Milo just inspired a bunch of kids to go buy crane scales, and they're gonna start taking pictures of their newtons for IG. That's gonna be super cool.
it's gonna be epic, dude. Let's go. Um, in terms of that, like I think there is an early adoption cost in terms of you can't compare yourselves to others, or like in powerlifting, oh, you know what the standard for your weight class is in terms of the world class level. Um, and there's also the again, like before, gauging progression, prescribing the right load, making sure you're training sufficiently close to failure, and so forth. There is that early adoption cost, but I don't see why necessarily isometrics would be worse for hypertrophy, even though it's something everyone has at the back of their minds at all time. Like don't do bad things in life, like that sort of
The
dogma.
thing that's so interesting about this is like there's your home gym. You know what I mean? Like
It's also
if that
it's
works
also
out,
way more
like
controllable.
yeah, right. Like if it does, like yeah, I mean that's just like an interesting concept to think about. Like if you're on vacation and you bring a stiff something you can place against a surface and be able to put max force into it, like you don't need weights. Like you know what I mean? Like that's an interesting idea to think about in general. I mean, I would say based on the work that we have, that's obviously not a terrible idea if you're on vacation or something like that. Like
Yeah.
that'd be a really cool application of that without having to lug around like dumbbells or whatever in your suitcase. That would be a pretty interesting application. So that's
Is there
interesting.
any reason isometrics would be more damaging?
Not to my knowledge. You're asking the wrong guy here. My PhD's on range of motion, not
Yeah, yeah.
isometrics.
Yeah, I'm almost curious if yeah, I'm just starting to
The
think of some
same
of the downsides, right?
the only thing would be in my mind would be at the same joint angle producing active force for a long
Yeah,
sustained
yeah.
period of time in which that
Yeah.
potentially
And
could be
and
worse.
this is why and we talked about this in the last podcast episode how the muscle length might modulate the relationship between proximity to the quote unquote ideal proximity to failure and for maximizing muscle growth in a way that doesn't absolutely torch you basically. But all that's to say is to basically agree with what Milo said. Like I think a good like all of this should be idea fuel, and I don't think any applications should be extrapolated too far. So like for example, yeah, we have a study comparing a leg curl A versus leg curl B, and one of the leg curls, took the hamstrings through a longer muscle length, and that seemed to lead to greater growth. Uh, we're still trying to figure out why all three heads of the triceps grew more in this new study, but we have a pretty good uh, rationale for why the triceps long head grew more in the study, and it seems to line up a pretty decent, pretty decently with the other research. So I feel like that's a pretty safe implementation. Whereas starting to get into the the more like the further you extrapolate those concepts, the more risky it is, right? Like people, like no matter who's listening to this, someone's achieved much more than you have in spite of not doing isometrics at a long muscle length, right? Um, so I would just really echo what Milo said there, about just not extrapolating too far because there's potentially unforeseen consequences and downstream effects that we're just not aware of.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wrap that one up.
It's for sure true. I think it's obviously everyone wants to have an understanding of how, let's say you have muscle length, right? Muscle length can operate from the shortest to the longest. So there's a continuum or spectrum, I guess. And then there's hypertrophy, which is another like continuum or spectrum from the most hypertrophy to least hypertrophy. Kind of want to see what the relationship between those two variables is like, and instinctively want to know how that changes at each level. But ultimately, a lot of these studies don't function at either end of that sort of shortest muscle length or longest muscle length spectrum. And even range of motion. So there's full range of motion, and at the very other end of that spectrum, there's isometrics. Very few studies compare isometrics to full range of motion. So the most partial range of motion you can think of would be an isometric, where I guess it technically wouldn't even be range of motion anymore, but you get what I mean. Very few studies actually compare those two concepts. And so while it would be really cool to know what the relationship is like at those extremes, you don't really know. You only know, by and large, within the sort of studied boundaries, which are generally pretty partial ranges of motion, like maybe up to down to 20-30% of full range of motion, and maybe up to 70-80% of range of motion, so sort of around the 80 to 20% of range of motion for partial range of motion, of full range of motion, comparing that to full range of motion. So it's not as though the isometrics at long muscle lengths versus full range of motion have been studied extensively. A lot of this is just theory crafting at best. But if a lot of the mechanisms behind hypertrophy and behind what you're trying to achieve, which is again hypertrophy, don't really give you second thought on doing something, I think it might be at least worth trying. Now, until we have studies comparing isometrics and long muscle lengths to a full range of motion, for example, am I going to go out of my way to everyone in the gym, stop them and be like, sorry, sir, I see you doing squats. What you should really be doing is sitting at the bottom for as long as you can, for as heavy as you can for 60 seconds. No, I'm not going to be doing that. But I think if you want to experiment, now is a good time to try maybe some partials at lower muscle lengths. And if you want to, you can, for example, for hypertrophy, pause at lower muscle lengths during a rep, like for half a second or something, so that potentially you spend more of your set at lower muscle lengths, do more of your work there, accrue more tension at that muscle length. But yeah, as you said, don't take it too far. I think give it some thought, maybe incorporate it here and there, and then as more evidence comes out, maybe you can shift more or less towards that approach.
Awesome. All right, last one. So kind of going back to the regional hypertrophy question, one thing that I've been thinking about is, so you mentioned for the most part, it seems like the evidence doesn't suggest that training with longer muscle length, partial range of motion training results in worse proximal hypertrophy, which would be a theoretical downside that just doesn't seem to play out with what we have. My question is, it's kind of a two-parter. One, do you think that is because what you just said is that for the most part, the partial range of motions at a shorter muscle length maybe aren't like the exercises we would think that kind of optimize that, if you know what I mean? Like we kind of have this middle ground bias of the research, I would imagine, again, although tell me if I'm wrong, where it's a little bit longer muscle length or a little bit shorter muscle length, but we're really not looking at the extremes, which I think if you're going to see meaningful outcomes in small sample research in 8-week training studies, that's probably what you have to do in order to kind of get at these kind of interesting outcomes. So that's kind of the first part of this is like, okay, if we did an exercise that was designed to train the shortest muscle length and have a failure point at the shortest position, like a biceps curl that's like as flexible a shoulder as possible and is really challenging when you flex your bicep all the way in, do you think that that would result in potentially different regional hypertrophy? And then a follow-up question off that in terms of like an application of these ideas is right now, what do you think is a better application of this? If that first premise is true, in terms of like if we actually have a shortened exercise that is really solid, do you think that taking one of those exercises and then just extending task failure to be at a long muscle length to which you're doing partials at the end of the range of motion, so you basically failed at every single joint angle? Or is it important to have high performance and not be fatigued in that long muscle length to which you would start the set potentially doing partials or something like that? This is something Josh and I have talked about a few times in terms of, exercise order, myo reps, drop sets, stuff like that. For the most part, performance doesn't seem to be acute performance. Sorry, this is not in terms of like chronic performance, but like in the short term, performance doesn't seem to be paramount for hypertrophy, probably more so for strength. So this is another application of that where if we have some of these exercises that challenge the range of motion in a more shortened position, this may limit the muscle length to some degree, but the failure point would be a little bit different. Can we remove some of those downsides of fatigue of having really high performance at those more stretched positions while still getting high tension in those positions by basically decreasing the failure point all the way down and making sure we're exposing high tension to all those parts of the range of motion, as opposed to just doing partials at the longest position where we theoretically get that stimulus, but we're maybe missing out on regional hypertrophy and maybe getting more fatigue because we're really applying maximum force in that lengthened position. What do you think?
Sure. So I'm going to address your second question first because I'm not sure I got the first one. Um, I think essentially what you're asking is how important is spending all of your set in those long muscle lengths versus potentially having those short muscle lengths included, provided that the long muscle lengths are still the most challenging and the preponderance of your sort of set tension, etc., is spent at those long muscle lengths. Did I get that sort of right?
I think the simple nugget of it is, do we need to get the long muscle lengths or expose ourselves to long muscle lengths when we are not fatigued, basically? Can we get the benefits of those while still being fatigued? In the example that I provided, if I start the movement, that's like one of these classic shortened exercises, which is like part of the first part of the question that we traditionally think is more in theory better for proximal hypertrophy. If we just extend task failure to not just be full range of motion reps, but literally be to the point where I can no longer produce force and it turns to an isometric at a completely extended elbow, does that still provide the benefits of longer muscle length training that you would do if you were just performing that exercise with partials to begin with? We would get to that point with considerably less performance and more fatigue, but you'd still be exposing yourself there with high tension. That's kind of the thing I'm thinking.
Gotcha. So essentially you're asking, would a set at just long muscle lengths to failure be as productive or less productive than a set that you do full range of motion until you can't do the shortened part anymore, and then you just do the lengthened part until eventually you can just do the asymmetric, and then you can't even do the asymmetric anymore. Correct?
Bingo. Yep.
So I think the set where you first fail in the shortened muscle length and then at the long muscle lengths and then incrementally until you can't do anything anymore, you just go home and cry. That set would be more stimulating for sure because you just essentially, it is essentially like a forced rep set, like a very, very forced reps, like taken to an extreme where initially you have this full range of motion rep and then you shorten the range of motion to make it, again, be before failure, and then you do it again and again and again. Like you're essentially doing infinite iterations of a new type of forced reps until you get to an isometric iteration. So yeah, it'd be a hell of a lot more stimulating because you're going way past failure. It would probably be really, really fatiguing too, is my hunch. Like really fatiguing. And I guess some bodybuilders actually do that, like have done that in the past, where they do lateral raises until like shoulder level, and then eventually they drop all the way down until they can't move it anymore unless they use their hips, and eventually even their hips don't do anything anymore. It'd be more stimulating. It'd also be a lot more fatiguing. And from the evidence we have on training past failure and even training to failure, generally the relationship between fatigue and going to failure and even beyond failure really isn't favorable. So I would say the partial range of motion set at long muscle lengths is favorable, for sure, because essentially there you're just taking it to failure, right? Whereas in the first example with the set where you incrementally fail at long muscle lengths, that would be taking it to failure like a lot of times, essentially. We're doing forced reps, but a lot of forced reps. And in general, I think the literature is suggesting that the stimulus to fatigue ratio, once again, probably worsens as you get to failure, probably, and then past failure, almost certainly. So I'd say if I had to pick one, do more sets at long muscle lengths only, rather than doing one set that will destroy you and also probably incorporate some of those muscle lengths that likely aren't as productive for hypertrophy.
Can I jump in here? And I think this is a good time to say what I think is my general take home and see if you guys agree with it. And I think this is relevant to like this question you just asked, Zach, is that Milo, you kind of mentioned like the infographic that we posted, basically trying to say like, hey, which of these variables seems to be like driving, you know, maximum hypertrophy outcomes, right? The first being total range of motion. As we talked about here, we were kind of questioning whether that matters at all. So that's, it might matter to some degree, but it doesn't seem to be driving it. The second one is the muscle length at the failure point, right? Or the most difficult portion of the range of motion. And that's kind of what Zach is getting at right there, is like you're essentially getting both the muscle length at the failure point and long muscle lengths with that example, because you're getting a failure point at every single muscle length, especially and also that longest muscle length at the very bottom. And Milo's hunch is that the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, and I would generally agree with that. I also think that kind of overlaps with our general take on the influence of proximity to failure on hypertrophy outcomes. Is like, you don't, in order to benefit from a certain portion of the range of motion, producing tension at a certain muscle length, you don't have to be all the way at, like maximum fatigue or like the inability to produce sufficient force anymore to move the load. My hunch is that you want to expose yourself to long muscle lengths and have some degree of tension that isn't like all out, like if I, I literally can't move this partial rep anymore. Because that's, like you said, Milo, the juice probably isn't worth the squeeze. The fatigue probably outweighs any stimulus benefit there. But you do probably want some decent tension down there based on all of these studies we've kind of discussed up to this point. So again, in short, my kind of take home is muscle length seems to matter a lot. You want some degree of tension, a good amount of tension, but making dang sure that is the failure point may or may not be beneficial and might have a significant drawback in terms of training fatigue. What do you guys think? Poke holes in that.
I'm with that for the most part. I would. I'm a little bit skeptical on the whole fatigue discussion. Milo, we discussed this before. What does fatigue mean? How do we measure it in research? That kind of thing. That whole thing is a little bit challenging to me to even bring up. But the reason I bring that up is like I said with the first part of the question. In theory, if there is any benefit to training a muscle when it's challenged at a shortened position, only one of those two examples is going to be able to do that. And anecdotally, the thing I'm particularly thinking of is back movements. I've tried both. I've tried doing a back exercise that is more challenging when you're in a contracted position and continuing the set until I'm failing at that lengthened position versus loading it so that lengthened portion is the only thing you can do. Purely anecdotally, subjective sense of stimulus, I think it's considerably better, just like you said. I don't feel as waxed after that as I would expect. So that is one thing I just would be interested to kind of see. But it is completely contingent on the fact that there is some sort of benefit to training at that shorter length. There may or may not be, and that be again, it's basically contingent upon that. So I don't know if that would actually be the case. But in general, other than that, Josh, I would generally agree. It slightly changes the proximity to failure thing to me when you're exposing yourself to different ranges of motion. That's the thing, is like basically in the one example, you have 25 RAR in the shortened position. So that doesn't even come close to meeting our shortened criteria for meeting whatever RAR threshold is for effectiveness. Do you need to go to the point, like I said, where you fail at every single range of motion and you're like struggling to do isometrics? There's probably a middle ground there. You could fail, at the completely full range of motion, fail in the mid range, maybe one more time and then stop there, something like that, where you're kind of getting in the middle zone. But yeah, I'm rambling at this point. That was kind of my thought off that.
The scientist in me absolutely hates these general recommendations of like 0 to 3 RAR or train through a full range of motion. Now, to be clear, those are great general recommendations because people aren't going to butcher them. They're very easy and they're going to cover you 95% of the time. But again, the scientist in me isn't a big fan of them because, like you're saying there, right, Zach, like you almost need to think of RAR at every segment of the range of motion, at every segment of the muscle length, right? So like if you're doing some sort of row that is hardest at the shortened position, right, close to your body, which is most rows, that is like 0 RAR there is not the same as if you're able to rig up a row that's hardest at a longer muscle length. And that's kind of what I'm getting at when I'm saying that you need some degree of tension in that long range of motion, but it doesn't need to be like the failure point, is my hunch. So yeah, and the full range of motion thing, right? Like, again, we were kind of questioning whether that independently actually influences muscle growth. But if you do a full range of motion in most exercises people do at the gym, you're going to get exposed to some degree of tension at a long muscle length, thus checking that box. So they're great practical recommendations, broad sweeping claims, but there's that additional layer that I think can lead to some of these more quote unquote advanced techniques based on what this research is indicating, whether that's lengthened partials, how hard should you go in terms of those lengthened partials, etc.
I'm going to poke in here and then we're going to give Milo the last word. One research project, if anybody wants an idea potentially that I think would be really interesting, is 4 groups, which is already kind of ambitious, but a isometric at a long muscle length, an isometric at a short muscle length, and then within each of those two, a percentage of force loss as a proxy for proximity to failure to see if that actually makes a difference in terms of strength and hypertrophy. I think that would be extremely interesting. And it also would provide at a fixed force loss between the two groups. It also kind of get at the question we're talking about for Milo stuff. So I think that, anybody's looking for a range of motion topic, I think that would be extremely interesting. But yeah, Milo, last word.
That's a
Yeah,
great
sure.
idea.
So I think towards the end of that discussion, it sort of veered towards the matching resistance curve to strength curve discussion, which is inherently a part of range of motion discourse, let's say. Um, Now, whenever it's been directly investigated, there's been 2 studies so far looking at trying to match the resistance curve of an exercise to the strength curve of an exercise. Um, Hypertrophy just hasn't really seemed to change between groups. Like, it doesn't really seem to do anything. And so I react the same way to sort of this topic as I do to people really forcing back exercises are hard, the short muscle length, so let's try and make it perfectly matched to our strength curves. Let's make it just as challenging at the bottom as we're strong in that position. I think it's a cool idea, and before any studies existed on this, mechanistically, I was like, yeah, hell yeah, let's do it. Let's get every fiber to failure at every point in that exercise during the last rep, such that every fiber, every muscle group involved in that exercise gets ideal stimulus and reaches failure at exactly the same time. It'd be beautiful, like just gorgeous. Except now that it's actually been directly investigated, it just doesn't seem to play out. So it's likely not that important. And so the uniformity or um, the correspondence between the strength curve of your strength curve and the resistance curve of an exercise likely doesn't matter that much. And so when we're talking about the failure point of an exercise and whether it's important that it's at a short muscle length or long muscle length, or making sure that you're reaching failure at long muscle lengths necessarily. Now, obviously, I don't think you should do, again, using the lateral raise example, I don't think lateral raises are ideal for side delts because there's little to no tension on the side delts at the bottom. But do I think the failure point needs to be at the bottom? No, otherwise, you'd expect those studies matching strength curve to resistance curve to show better hypertrophy likely for the group doing those sorts of exercises. Um, so I think in general, I see your point, but I think it's probably an exercise in futility to an extent to try and match those curves too much past a certain point. And very briefly, to go back to the point where for isometrics at long muscle lengths, or actually more saliently, the example you gave of trying to reach failure at each point, like gradually, there is a time and a place for that too. Like, let's say, for example, you were really limited on time. That probably gets you a lot of stimulus and not much time at all. So if you're gonna do like 2 sets a week, do those. Those are great for muscle growth. But then also, if you somehow wanted to do an exercise that is really difficult in a shortened position but pretty easy in a long position, but you trusted the new sort of evidence on long muscle lengths being important, but you didn't quite trust it enough to go all in and just do isometrics and long muscle lengths. You could do that sort of thing where you acknowledge that long muscle lengths are important. So on the exercises that are really where your failure point is at a short muscle length, you might do that technique where you still get the benefits of that high tension failure point at short muscle lengths, but you also get what you think is important, aka the tension at long muscle lengths. So that's what I thought I'd say as well.
Just to
Awesome.
make sure I'm understanding that correctly, what would that look like practically? So you do a set that's hardest at a short muscle
He was
length.
just saying exactly what I said. He's just saying
Okay.
that
Yeah,
would
so
be a
like
good application for it. Yeah.
a row,
Okay.
for example, you do a full
Yeah.
range of motion row until you fail at the shortened position, and then you just keep going until
Okay.
you can't row it at all anymore.
Yep.
Nice.
Yep.
Or you just load it up, do some isometrics.
Indeed.
You
You
go.
could do that as well, but that's probably less stimulating because you don't do forced reps. So if you're limited on time, what have you, and or if you don't trust the long muscle length literature or big long muscle length (TM) uh, very much, then you can still get the benefit of short muscle lengths and a full range of motion that way, while still getting what you think potentially might be the proven benefit of long muscle lengths.
Yep. Yep.
Nice.
Okay. Sweet. The title of this episode is going to be "Isometric Training is Optimal for Hypertrophy." Milo Wolf in quotes. Milo, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was awesome. I think we might have to have you on again sometime to talk about strength. We talked about that for like 3 seconds. So that'll be interesting. But we'll wait till some of your research is out to do that. But yeah, man, thanks for coming on. This was an awesome discussion. I definitely have some things to think about, and yeah, I just got a lot from this conversation. I think the listeners will as well. Before we sign off here, where can people find you? Where's all your stuff? All that good stuff.
First of all, thank you for having me. This was probably the most fun podcast I've ever done.
Probably, Josh. We didn't get the full commitment there.
Hey, next time. There's always space for room for improvement.
He still has an out by saying probably.
You can find me on Instagram at wolfcoach _ at the end because someone took my username and I'm very salty about it. Otherwise, at wolfcoaching.net for my website for coaching stuff. My actual name is Milo Wolf. So if you want to search me up on Facebook, stalk me, go for it. Or actually, ResearchGate and LinkedIn if you're professional. Yeah, that's about it. You can find me on all those cool places.
Awesome.
Oh,
well, yeah, guys. Oh, Josh,
we'll
go for it.
link.
He's going to do the sign off.
No. I'll just say
Okay.
we'll link that like in the description or something. I don't know. Zach does that, so we'll see if he actually does it. But
I don't know. I might not.
I'll take it.
You'll find Milo's somewhere.
I think what I'd
on
rather
LinkedIn
do,
or otherwise.
Yeah, I think what I'd rather do is go ahead and copy this file, clip it up, and make sure Milo just has all these quotes that are completely the antithesis of his actual views, and then I'll put that in the description and let people share that around. I think that'll be more fun, good content for Wolf coaching, and we'll go from there. But
the end of Milo Wolf.
Oh, that's also another good title, man. We got a lot of good titles. Yeah,
it'll make for good stories on Instagram alongside the entrepreneur and Sigma grind set memes I do.
Awesome. Well, yeah, guys, thanks for turning. Oh God, Josh, you timing this out? Go for it.
Wow, we got all Chiefs and no Indians here. All right, Milo, thanks for coming on. Thanks everybody for making it this far in the podcast. Please leave a rating and review, all that good stuff if you get a chance, and we'll see you next time. Take care.